Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, everyone. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Let me share my screen. Okay, are you all able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So today we'll be discussing from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 5, verse number 3. Geyasa nitya sannyasi
Nyeyasa nitya sannyasi
yona dveshti na kankshati
yona dveshti na kankshati
nirdvandvo hi mahabaho
nirdvandvo hi mahabaho
sukham bandhat pramuchyate.
sukham bandhat pramuchyate.
Geyasa nitya sannyasi
Nyeyasa nitya sannyasi
yona dveshti na kankshati
yona dveshti na kankshati
nirdvandvo hi mahabaho
nirdvandvo hi mahabaho
sukham bandhat pramuchyate.
sukham bandhat pramuchyate.
Geyasa nitya sannyasi
Nyeyasa nitya sannyasi
yona dveshti na kankshati
yona dveshti na kankshati
nirdvandvo hi mahabaho
nirdvandvo hi mahabaho
sukham bandhat pramuchyate.
sukham bandhat pramuchyate. Nyeyasa nitya sannyasi
Geyasa nitya sannyasi
yona dveshti na kankshati
yona dveshti na kankshati
nirdvandvo hi mahabaho
nirdvandvo hi mahabaho
sukham bandhat pramuchyate.
sukham bandhat pramuchyate. Synonyms: Geya
Yeya
should be known,
should be known.
Saha
Saha
he,
ye
Nitya
nitya
always,
always.
Sannyasi
Sannyasi
renouncer,
announcer.
Yah
Yaha
who,
who
Na
na
never,
never.
Dveshti
Dveshti
abhors,
abhors.
Na
Na
nor,
nor
Kankshati
kankshati
desires,
desires.
Nirdvandvaha
Nirdvandvaha
free from all dualities.
free from all dualities.
He
He
certainly,
certainly.
Mahabaho,
Mahabaho,
O mighty armed one,
Almighty armed one.
Sukham
To come
happily,
happily.
Bandhat
Bandha
from bondage,
from bondage.
Pramuchyate
Pramuchyate
is completely liberated.
is completely liberated.
Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation: one who neither hates nor desires the fruits of his activities is known to be always renounced. Such a person, free from all dualities, easily overcomes material bondage and is completely liberated, O mighty armed Arjuna. Purport: one who is fully in Krishna consciousness is always a renouncer because he feels neither hatred nor desire for the results of his actions. Such a renouncer, dedicated to the transcendental loving service of the Lord, is fully qualified in knowledge because he knows his constitutional position in his relationship with Krishna. He knows fully well that Krishna is the whole and that he is part and parcel of Krishna. Such knowledge is perfect because it is qualitatively and quantitatively correct. The concept of oneness with Krishna is incorrect because the part cannot be equal to the whole. Knowledge that one is one in quality yet different in quantity is correct transcendental knowledge, leading one to become full in himself, having nothing to aspire to or lament over. There is no duality in his mind because whatever he does for Krishna. Being thus freed from the platform of dualities, he is liberated, even in this material world. Namam Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swamiti Namini. Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschata Doshakarane. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So here in this verse, I'll repeat the translation once again. One who neither hates nor desires the fruits of his activities is known to be always renounced. Such a person, free from all dualities, easily overcomes material bondage and is completely liberated. O mighty Amritama. So this chapter, it starts with Arjuna asking the question from Krishna that between renouncing or sannyasa and karma yoga, which one is superior? And in the previous verse, as Krishna indicates, although both are good, but between the two, karma yoga or action in Krishna consciousness is superior. Right? So here, the idea is of renouncement, right? What is renouncement or what is renouncing? So there are two types of renouncings, right? And actually, Srila Rupa Goswami, Nectar of Devotion, explains it very nicely. One of them is called Falgu Vairagya, and the other one is called Yukta Vairagya, right? So Falgu Vairagya essentially means that we externally renounce everything, but internally we are still thinking about all kinds of sense gratifications, right? So that Vairagya is not of much use. It's called Falgu Vairagya. And Yukta Vairagya essentially means to utilize everything in the service of Krishna. Just like Srila Prabhupada, he utilized pretty much everything, right? So he traveled using the airplanes, using the motor car, using the railways. He used the recorder to essentially transcribe all of his lectures into text, right? So he used all of the technology that was available at that time in the service of the Supreme Lord, in preaching Krishna consciousness. Whereas there are many spiritualists or so-called spiritualists where the prime focus is to give up all things material, right? So for example, some people, they are just totally cut off from the external society, right? They create kind of their own bubble and they don't even use electricity. They just stay within the community and try to renounce everything material as much as possible, but from internal standpoint, right, they're still desirous of sense gratification, right? So such a vairagya, which is external and not internal, it's called Falgu Vairagya. It is not of any use. The superior Vairagya, which is Yukta Vairagya, is essentially the core idea is to engage everything in the service of the Supreme Lord, right? And many a times people misunderstand the true purport of Karma Yoga. And here actually Prabhupada explains the true purport of Karma Yoga very, very nicely, right? So anything or any activity that is done for the pleasure of the Supreme Lord, right? So action performed for the pleasure of the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord is basically Karma Yoga. That is the true definition. One of the most famous things whenever you hear about Bhagavad Gita from anyone, right? People usually say, karma karo, phal ki ichha nahi mat karo, right? So you just act, but do not desire the fruits of your actions. So that's one of the most famous so-called understanding of Bhagavad Gita that you would get when you go out and inquire about Bhagavad Gita. That's like, this has been popularized by the karmis, but that's not really the true purpose of Karma Yoga. The true purpose of Karma Yoga is action performed in Krishna consciousness, right? And therefore, Prabhupada, whenever he translates Karma Yoga, he always uses this action performed for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord, or action performed in Krishna consciousness, right? So that is the highest form of Karma Yoga. That is the true meaning of Karma Yoga. That whatever actions we perform, we do that for the pleasure of the Supreme Lord, right? And if you think about it, it is very, very practical, right? And it makes complete sense. So, I mean, just think about it. If someone asks you to do something, right, or you're asked to do an action, an activity, and there is no motivation behind it, right? It's someone just asks you to just do it. That just seems so impractical, right? If I'm supposed to act, right, or I'm supposed to do something, but there is no real reason behind that action, that activity, then it will be very, very difficult for me to do that action, right? So that seems very, very impractical. But what we say, that when we understand the true purpose of Karma Yoga, the prescription is that actually it is not unmotivated. There is a motivation, right? Whenever we perform any action, there has to be some motivation behind it, right? But that motivation should simply be satisfaction of the Supreme Lord, right? So whatever action, activities, or whatever motivations we may have today to perform our day-to-day activities, or any activity for that matter, right? There is always some motivation behind it, but we somehow have to channelize that motivation, right? And that happens through practice. It cannot happen overnight, right? But through practice, we have to kind of channelize that desire, that the action needs to be performed for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord. Just like in the case of Arjun, right? He is in the middle of the battleground and he's a Kshatriya, right? So he absolutely wants to fight the war, and he came into the war in Kurukshetra to fight the war. Now he gets nervous when he gets in the middle of the battleground and he looks at all of his relatives, on the other side. He gets a little nervous, but he was motivated to fight because he's Kshatriya, and it is his duty to protect the religious principles, right? But he eventually fought for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord, because the Supreme Lord wanted him to fight the battle of Kurukshetra, Mahabharata, to preserve the religious principles. He fought for satisfying the Supreme Lord, and by doing that, Arjuna showed us how to perform Karma Yoga, right? So Karma Yoga essentially means to engage ourselves in actions, but rather than thinking that we just have to act. That's very, very impractical advice, right? The true purpose of Karma Yoga is to act for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord. And in fact, Krishna says that we have to perform karma as a yagya. Yagnartharth karmano netra lokoyam karma bandhana tad artham karma kaunteya mukta sangha samachara. Krishna says, right? Yagnarthat karmano netra. So we have to perform our action as a yagya. Yagna arthat karma, right? So yagnarthat karmano anyatra. Anyatra means if you do it with any other motivation but yagya, lokoyam karma bandhana. That action will become the cause of your bondage to this material world, right? So if we perform action that is not yagya, and we will come to the definition of yagya as well, right? But if we perform action with any other motivation which is not yagya, that will become the reason for our bondage to this material world. Yagnathat karmano natra lokoyam karma bandhana tad artham karma kaunteya. And if we do it as a yagya, if we do our activities as a yagya, tad artham karma kaunteya mukta sangha samachara. that will have the total opposite reaction, right? That will lead one for the complete detachment or liberation from the bondage of this material world. Mukta Sangha Samachara, Krishna says. Samachara means completely. Mukta means liberation. Sangha means association, right? So that karma which is performed as a yajna results in complete detachment or liberation from the bondage of this material world, right? That is so powerful, right? So action performed as a yajna needs to be done rather than simply renouncing action or not doing anything. Although Krishna does not say that it is wrong to renounce action completely, but Krishna says that acting for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord is superior, right? And it is much more practical. So there could be a few people who could basically just sit inside a cave without doing anything, and even mentally they may be able to give up action. But we could see, especially in this age of Kali, it is extremely difficult for us. And in fact, in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna does not recommend that to Arjun. And Arjun at one point suggests that, why don't you just want me to go ahead and sit under a tree? Just why do you want me to fight this war? But Krishna says, because you are a Kshatriya, if you leave this war, mentally, you will always and constantly be engaged in this war. Although you may be sitting under a tree or inside a cave, but because you have a propensity to fight, right? Your mind will always be engaged in the fighting. So physically just sitting inside a cave and not picking the bow and an arrow does not mean that you're not engaged in action. Mental meditation of activity itself will result in bondage, right? And ultimately, you would neither be there nor be here, right? People in this battlefield will say, oh, Arjuna was such a coward. He got scared and he left the war, right? So that will result into infamy. And for a Kshatriya, infamy is worse than even death, right? So Krishna gave Arjuna a very, very practical advice. And in the previous verse, he directly says that of the two activities performed for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord, or yajna. So the essential purport of the word yajna is any action that is performed for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord is called yajna. Bhoktaram yajna tapasam sarva loka maheshwaram suhridam sarva bhutanam gyatva mam shantiricchati, Krishna says. Right? Bhoktaram yajna tapasam. So I am the ultimate beneficiary of all of the yajnas and penances. Tapas means penance and yajna. Bhoktaram yajna tapasam sarva loka maheshwaram. And I am the proprietor of everything, of all of the worlds. And suhridam sarva bhutanam gyatva mam shantiricchati. Right? So if we understand the true purport of this verse, because Krishna is the beneficiary of all the yajnas, in other words, we could say that any activity, anything that is done for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord is yajna. Right? So action that is performed for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord needs to be done. And if such an action is performed in that spirit, that we want to do it for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord, that results in complete liberation from the bondage of this material world. But artificially renouncing artificially renouncing the action, although our propensity is to act, that is of no use. And in fact, Krishna also suggests, niyatam kuru karma tvam karma jayo hi karmana sharir yatra pichatena prasiddhyeta karmana, Krishna says, right? Essentially a similar kind of verse which Krishna is speaking. Niyatam kuru karma tvam. So niyatam means propensities. According to one's propensities, one should indulge in action. Niyatam kuru karma tvam karma jayo hi karmana. So karma, or performing one's actions, are always superior than not performing actions. Sharir yatra pichatena prasiddhyeta karmana. What to speak of anything else, but one cannot even maintain this body if one is attached to not performing one's action, Krishna is saying, right? So if we just give up work and we do not do anything, we cannot even feed ourselves, right? Because we need to act, we need to render some service in this world to earn our livelihoods. Therefore, action is always superior to inaction, but action should be done in what spirit? In the spirit of yajna, or in the spirit of satisfying the senses of the Supreme Lord. And when we engage ourselves in that way, such an action results in complete liberation from the bondage of this material world. Right? And what happens when a person does that? Gradually, so currently whatever we do, whatever actions we perform, the motivation is we want to enjoy the results of that particular activity, right? So for example, we are working really, really hard, let's say in our day-to-day 9 to 5 jobs, and the motivation is that we want to, earn some money out of it, and then that money could be utilized in all kinds of activities. Someone may want to buy a big new car, or may want to go out on a vacation, right? Or may want to have good, nice clothes, or even the idea, to satisfy one's family, buying new jewelry for a wife, or giving good education to the kids, right? All of that. So everything, the motivation, all of these kind of motivations, right? They are all material motivations, right? But if we think that all of this money that we are earning, eventually we have to do our activities or our actions, and we have certain responsibilities given to us by Krishna, right? So this family, the wife, the kids, all of them have been provided to us as a responsibility by Krishna. So we have to somehow fulfill that responsibility, and therefore that money, a portion of that money should be utilized in fulfilling that responsibility, because we are in the grihastha ashram. But it should not be just, we provide for them. Providing is not sufficient. We also have to ensure that people who Krishna have provided to us as our responsibility, they make some progress towards Krishna consciousness, right? So of course, material provisions, good education, sumptuous food, and all of that is important. Those are the basic necessities of life. But we also need to ensure that whatever responsibilities Krishna has given, we kind of fulfill them and make sure that those people are also able to relish Krishna consciousness, right? So we should try our best to engage everyone in Krishna consciousness, particularly people for whom we are directly responsible. And when we do that, that is the true way of basically, fulfilling our responsibilities that Krishna has provided. So when we think that way, when we act in this fashion, right? When we indulge a portion of our whatever actions we perform and whatever output we get out of it, and when we indulge a portion of that output in this fashion, in a responsible manner, right, then that becomes grihasthashram, and that is actually recommended. And then similarly, a portion of that money that we earn should also be spent in spreading Krishna consciousness all over the world, right? So we should donate to the temple. We should try to strengthen this preaching movement as much as possible, right? So a portion of that wealth should certainly be used for that purpose as well. And when we do that, when gradually our motivation is simply the satisfaction of the Lord, right? And we can tie our satisfaction to the fact that we need to satisfy the Lord, right? So ultimately, we have to design our lives in such a way that the only satisfaction we achieve in our lives is that we are able to relish Krishna consciousness, that we are able to relish Harinam, that we are able to relish our japa, right? That we are able to relish the service towards the Supreme Lord, right? That is what really matters, right? That is actually the only perfection or only gain that we can have in this material world. All of the other satisfactions, right? All of the other sense of satisfaction that we get. For example, we can set a target. Okay, I want to create $1 million house for myself, right? I set that goal that in next 5 years, I want to create $1 million house for myself, right? And I work towards that, and I work really, really hard. And eventually I'm able to create that $1 million house, right? But eventually that $1 million house will stay for some time, right? And eventually, that will be gone, or that building might stay, but I will be gone, right? And once you're gone and you take birth at some other place as some other person, you don't even know the person who created that house, right? And no one else knows, right? Eventually it's meaningless. Similarly, any kind of and we kind of set these targets, these little small material targets, and we try to get some satisfaction out of them, right? So to make that $1 million house, I would have to work really, really hard for those 5 years, and eventually I'm able to make it, and it will give me some satisfaction, but then the goalpost will shift again, right? And some other material motivation I will have to utilize to engage in action, right? So when we set these materialistic goals and we engage in action to satisfy those materialistic goals, we need to understand that the satisfaction derived from the fulfillment of such materialistic goals is temporary, right? There is no real benefit out of it, right? But if we dovetail our entire satisfaction to the service of the Supreme Lord, right? Gradually, the only satisfaction we should get is how much am I able to relish Krishna consciousness? How much am I able to relish Harinam, right? And that is one of the litmus tests to ascertain how much spiritually mature have I become over a period of time. So over a period of time, as I'm practicing Krishna consciousness, as I'm performing my japa, as I'm following the four regulative principles, as I'm listening to Srimad Bhagavatam, and as I'm following the instructions of my Guru Maharaj, right, as the process is working, gradually we have to understand that the sense of satisfaction that we have in our lives, the only thing that should be left as a satisfaction should be to what extent are we able to relish the japa or the harinam and rendering service to the Supreme Lord. Everything else we should understand that it should eventually fail to satisfy my senses or myself, right? That is one of the litmus tests, right? And as we become more and more spiritually mature, we will feel that that desire or the sense of satisfaction in rendering service to the Supreme Lord through japa, through chanting, by serving the spiritual master, by engaging in book distribution, right? Or by engaging other people in Krishna consciousness, right? By all of the Krishna conscious activities that have been described or that have been taught to us by our acharyas, gradually we will find that our sense of satisfaction is completely tied to those activities. And we cannot find any satisfaction in achieving material goals, right? That is the state where we want to be, right? That is the litmus test of how much of a spiritual maturity have we acquired in this birth, right? And when we gradually do that, that is really the perfection of life. And that's what Krishna means when he says that we will be able to overcome material bondage and be completely liberated, right? So liberation does not mean that we just do not we cut off all of the contacts with this material world. We do not consume power that is generated in the power plants. We just set a perimeter for ourselves, and we just live there without any contact with the material world. No, that is not the idea. The idea is, although externally I may be engaged with hundreds of people, when I'm working day in and day out, but the sense of satisfaction that I get in my life is only through all kinds of Krishna conscious activities, which is essentially, I should be satisfied in relishing the Harinam, in book distribution, in how much am I able to engage people more and more in Krishna consciousness, right? And I should gather no satisfaction at all. Even if I'm able to create $1 billion company, eventually I have to understand that this is temporary, right? It will ultimately fade away. There is no point of it. For some time, people may remember me as one of the founders of that $1 billion enterprise, but eventually it will be lost, right? And there have been so many people in the past who have created $1 billion companies, right? Now, who remembers them? Hardly anyone, right? You may have some memorial or in some history books, you may find their names. In fact, when people read about them, there is a lot of bad stuff that comes out, and many people feel what a pathetic person that person was, right? Recently, we saw Bill Gates. He had such an aura around himself, but we recently saw how during the divorce, so many things came out about him as well, right? So that's what happens. Any material achievement is temporary, and we have to understand that all of that will eventually fade, right? So as we become and grow more and more mature, spiritually mature, right, our sense of satisfaction should be completely tied to the satisfaction of or satisfying the Supreme Lord, right? How much are we able to satisfy the Supreme Lord? So that is the idea, and that is the true purpose of karma yoga, or action performed in Krishna consciousness, right? So external renunciation is not really recommended, and it is not really, especially it's not practical in today's world. and especially within ISKCON, because we are all followers of Srila Prabhupada, who could have been more engaged with technology, with materialistic tools, or with people. Prabhupada was always, surrounded by so many people. All kinds of scientists used to come and visit Srila Prabhupada. All kinds of professors teaching in, top universities used to come to Srila Prabhupada. All kinds of students, all kinds of hippies, all kinds of politicians, right? So Prabhupada constantly throughout his life engaged and dealt with all kinds of people, right? But his source of satisfaction was, he never created, his purpose was not to create $1 billion enterprise. That was never his objective. The only objective that Srila Prabhupada had was to make every individual who he met into a Krishna conscious individual, right? He wanted to transform everyone. He wanted to give Krishna consciousness to the entire world. And it was his firm understanding that Krishna consciousness is the only solution for all of the problems that exist in this material world, right? So he was a true karma yogi in that sense, right? He was totally 100% engaged, and his entire satisfaction was only coming from the fact that he was trying to satisfy the will of his spiritual master and the Supreme Lord himself, right? So it is very important for us to understand, what does it really mean to satisfy the Supreme Lord, right? Sometimes there is this question that, in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is there to tell Arjuna what is the right thing to do, right? Krishna is there to guide him. Krishna is there to tell him that, the right thing to do is to fight the war, because, one of the things for which I come in this material world is to establish the religious principles. And because the other side, if they win the war, they will be spreading irreligiosity throughout the planet. So that won't be very good, right? So I would like Arjuna to fight this war and establish religious principles and thereby serve me in that capacity, right? So Krishna was directly there to guide Arjuna. But who do we have to guide us, right? Who tells us what do we need to do to satisfy the Supreme Lord, right? So that is the question that often comes, and we learn from Srila Prabhupada, right? So how did Srila Prabhupada find out what does he have to do to satisfy the Supreme Lord? He just simply followed the instructions of his spiritual master, right? So Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur told him that, whenever you get some money, please publish these books, please print these books, and you have a good command in the English language. So why don't you go to the Western world and preach the science of Krishna consciousness to the Westerners, right? And he took those instructions to the heart, and he took those instructions, although it is coming from Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur's mouth, but he took those instructions as directly coming from Krishna, right? And he made that the mission of his life. And then he lived his entire life to basically fulfill that desire of his spiritual master that he expressed to Srila Prabhupada. Similarly, we have to inquire submissively with our spiritual master that what is it that he wants from us. How can we engage ourselves in the service of the Supreme Lord, right? It cannot be whimsical, right? We cannot just think our own, from our own selves, what is it that we should do that would satisfy the Supreme Lord. We need to understand from our spiritual master. We need to inquire submissively from our spiritual master. And then the spiritual master is actually the one who guides us that this is what we need to do to serve the Supreme Lord, right? Now, it may not be the same instruction that Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur gave to Srila Prabhupada, right? So spiritual master gives the instructions to the disciple based on his qualifications and his skill sets and his abilities. Therefore, it is such an important relationship. So spiritual master and the disciple, we have to understand that the spiritual master is really the via medium through which we can approach the Supreme Lord. There is no way for any individual to approach the Supreme Lord without the spiritual master. It is simply impossible. And whoever says that is possible, he is not actually telling the truth. The fact is, even when Krishna comes, he accepts a spiritual master because he wants to set the correct examples. Although he's the Supreme Lord, he does not need a spiritual master, right? But whenever he comes in the material world, whether he came as Krishna himself or Lord Rama or Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, right? They all basically got initiation from a spiritual master, right? So Krishna teaches by his examples. So without the spiritual master, it is impossible for us to approach Krishna. So spiritual master is like a via medium. He is like a conduit, right? So a conduit is, a conduit, right? It's like a connection, a pipe that is used to send a certain material from the source to the destination. So spiritual master is like that conduit where he is basically connection between us and the Supreme Lord. And if we are not able to fit ourselves inside that conduit, it is impossible for us to reach the destination of the Supreme Lord. Therefore, it is very, very important for us to listen to our spiritual master and to develop attachment to the instructions of the spiritual master, not necessarily to his physical form. Of course, Vapu and Vani, both the things are important, but Vani is even more important than Vapu, right? So Vapu means to serve the spiritual master in the physical self of the spiritual master, and Vani means to serve the spiritual master by following the instructions that the spiritual master provides, right? So both of the things are good to do, but Vani is even more important than Vapu, right? And the entire idea is when we serve the spiritual master, we can develop an attachment towards him. And without us developing the attachment to the spiritual master or following the instructions of the spiritual master, it is impossible for us to attain perfection. It can never happen. Without the spiritual master, we can never attain perfection, right? And it is not so difficult for us to understand, right? So if I usually find this example very, very conducive, right? So Krishna says, Dukhalayam Ashashvatam, right? That's how Krishna defines this material world. So let's imagine, there is this huge building, and you can assume that this material world is this huge building which has many, many floors on it, right? And the building is on fire, right? There is fire all over, the bottom of the building, and you are somewhere on the 20th floor, 25th floor, and you could feel the heat. Although the smoke is not there, you cannot really see the fire, but some portions of the building you could feel like this extreme heat, and you are somehow trying to avoid that heat going from one room to the next room, right? That is our situation in this material world, right? Sometimes we get some patches during this life wherein we feel everything is good, and then suddenly something happens and we are totally devastated. We have to readjust our position, right? Something happens and we are just totally, oh my goodness, what really happened, right? And we have to readjust, and that keeps on happening in this material world, right? So we can imagine that's something like, there is a fire, we can't really see that fire because we do not really understand that this material world is Dukhalayam and Ashashvatam. Although we have heard this many times, that this material world is a place of misery and this is temporary, but we live this life thinking that this material world is a source of all the pleasures and this is permanent. That is how every individual lives his life, right? So we do not really realize that, right? And we simply keep moving from one room to the next room just to avoid that heat. Now suddenly you see there is this a fire fire marshal approaching and standing at the bottom of the building, and he tells you that there is this huge fire going on and he wants you to jump from that building, right? If you do not have faith on that person, if you have no attachment towards him, and you haven't even seen that there's a fire going on, right? Would you ever take the plunge from the 20th floor of the building thinking that this person can protect you? It is simply not possible, right? Because you do not have that faith, that attachment on that person, on whatever he's instructing. You have doubts about his knowledge, right? So if you fail to jump on the instruction of that fire marshal, eventually you will be consumed by that fire, right? Because that fire marshal could see that there is a fire, and sooner or later that fire will catch up with you, and you cannot see that. And the fire marshal kept on telling you that that's what's going to happen. But because you did not have faith on the instructions of that fire marshal and did not have attachment towards him, you just could not gather enough courage to take that plunge from the 20th floor, from that building, and allow the fire marshal to rescue you. But if you had faith on that person, let's suppose that fire marshal was your father, right, who has raised you, and you have developed a strong attachment towards him, and that whatever my father had told me from the childhood is always correct, and he will never do anything that will harm me in any way. In fact, he can go to any extent to protect me, right? You have that kind of faith, that kind of a trust, and you have complete trust on his instructions. You won't even think twice, right? You will immediately be able to gather that courage and take that plunge from the 20th floor, because you know that your father is very, very powerful and he will be able to protect you. And if he's saying that you will eventually be engulfed by that fire, you actually will be engulfed by that fire, right? So you have that faith in him. So the idea of faith is important from our perspective. We have to understand that it is very important. You know, we the spiritual master has no requirement for you to have faith in him, right? It's not serving him in any way. He has so many other disciples, who are serving him, and his sense of satisfaction is coming from serving Krishna and his spiritual master, right? All of the disciples that a spiritual master has, the disciples are not doing a favor to the spiritual master by serving him. In fact, spiritual master is doing a favor to the disciple by allowing the disciple to serve him, so that the disciple can develop that faith and attachment towards the instructions of the spiritual master. Because if he fails to do that, when the moment comes, he will not be able to surrender. And if the disciple is not able to surrender, there is no way he can take that plunge or he can use that conduit. If it does not enter into that conduit, there is no way he can be transferred to the ultimate destination, to the target, or he can be saved, right? There is simply no way. Therefore, it is extremely important for us to develop an attachment towards the instructions of the spiritual master. Whatever our spiritual master guides us or tells us, it is extremely, extremely important for us to develop an attachment towards it. And that is the other litmus test of our progress in Krishna consciousness. How much faith have we developed in the instructions of the spiritual master? To what extent can we surrender to the instructions of our spiritual master? There are so many devotees who give us the exact same guidance. They could be saying, chant 16 rounds, follow the 4 regulative principles, and the spiritual master is also saying the same. But that instruction coming from my spiritual master is millions and millions of times more important than anyone else saying those same words to me. Because those words have a special meaning to me, right? Those words are coming from that conduit that is my connection to Krishna. And it is very, very important for me to have that attachment to that instruction coming from the spiritual master himself. Therefore, we should always find some time to listen to our spiritual master, to associate with our spiritual master, whether through emails or whenever he's around, if he can go, if he's physically here in this material world, to find some opportunity to engage with him. And if the spiritual master is not here in the material world, we are so fortunate that, we have books, we have videos, we have lectures, we have our fellow God brothers and God sisters who have associated with the spiritual master. And when the spiritual master gave us the instructions, and that's why it's so important to have initiation from a living spiritual master, because at least that way you have some contact with that spiritual master, right? That connection is very, very important, to have those instructions coming from a living spiritual master, right? Because having a living spiritual master, the kind of impact, the physical attachment that we can develop towards instructions is extremely valuable, right? So we should always find some time to meditate upon the instructions of the spiritual master, to listen to his instructions, to listen to his lectures, to associate, with our God brothers and God sisters, to listen to the glories of our spiritual master in a private setting, because, ultimately our founder Acharya Srila Prabhupada, and there is no doubt that our 100% commitment belongs to Srila Prabhupada. He's the ultimate Shiksha Guru, right? But in a private setting, when we have, for example, the Avirbhava of our spiritual master, we should try to find and associate with our God brothers and glorify our spiritual master in a private setting, to develop that level of attachment towards his instructions, because ultimately our spiritual master is our conduit and connection to Krishna. And without us having sufficient amount of faith in his instructions and surrender into his instructions, it is almost impossible for us to be able to approach Krishna and to reach Krishna. So with that, I will pause. I covered 2 or 3 different themes here in this topic. If anyone has any questions or comments, please go ahead.
So, Abhiram Divya Prabhu, yajna, when you say yajna, you mean only devotional service? Because not all yajnas are necessarily purely devotional service.
Yeah, no, the word yajna means anything that is done for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord. That is the very simple definition of yajna. Anything, whatever act it could be, it may be, the action itself is not important, right? But the motivation behind that action. If the motivation is to serve the Supreme Lord, then that action becomes a yajna. It could be chanting, or it could be, my 9 to 5 job could be a yajna if I do it with that motivation that I'm doing that for serving the Supreme Lord.
Yeah, but in India, people do things like Mrityunjaya Homa,
Yes,
this Homa, that they are also called yajnas, technically speaking,
Correct.
And in one sense, they are offered to the Lord. You know what I'm saying? Even a Satyanarayana Puja or something is offered to the Lord.
Correct.
It's not offered to, some, even demigods or something like that. Sometimes it is directly offered to to the Lord. Satyanarayana is a Vishnu Tattva and everything.
Right.
But at the same time, like the priest at the end of the whole thing will say, like, let the family have arogya, ayusha, dhana, dhanya, sampatti,
Yes.
vidya, buddhi. Rarely have I seen a priest say, like, may their bhakti increase, or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's very cool.
So that would technically be called a yajna, but it's not really the true meaning of yajna, you're saying.
Right. Yeah. So what you're describing, and that is very true, right? We also understood yajna to be a fire sacrifice that is being presided over by a pandit, a Brahmin, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is the understanding of yajna that we had. But that is more of a karma kandi thing, it has been prescribed in the Vedas, and that is also done for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord only.
Yes, it is done for the satisfaction of the Supreme,
Yes.
yeah, but the motivation could be slightly different,
Correct. Yes. But Krishna makes it very, very clear, right? There is no doubt about the fact any action, it may not be a fire sacrifice. It could be anything, X, Y, Z, you can think of anything. Even what Arjuna did when he was fighting and killing.
Oh, it was a yajna, you're saying.
Was a
yeah.
yajna.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was a yajna because it was done for the satisfaction of the Lord. So
yeah, when you're distributing books, it's a yajna. When you're chanting, it's a yajna. Yeah.
Exactly. So this is 100% complete definition of the term yajna. Action performed for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord. That's it. Anything that fits into that definition is yajna.
Mm-hmm. But then what are those others? I mean, those are karmakandik, but they're also called yajnas sometimes technically. That's why I'm a little confused.
Yeah. So, but, restricting the term yajna just to those, as you also pointed out, right? Eventually, those are also done for the satisfaction of the Lord. So they also fall in that category. If they are done for the satisfaction of the Lord, they also fall in that category. But that's
on a higher level, yes, they are also done for the satisfaction of the Lord. But there is a slight lower motivation also within that higher, offering,
Right. No, from our standpoint, if I'm doing a fire sacrifice, I've seen people do a fire sacrifice so that India can win a particular cricket match, right? I've seen some of those news items where they are doing something to basically attain something material, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they are trying to satisfy some demigod to get some material outcome, right? It's more of a business transaction, right? So that's more like a business transaction that is being done to satisfy a particular demigod and to get a fruitive result out of it, right?
Right, but sometimes it may not even be a demigod. You might be offering something to a Vishnu Tattva deity.
Yes, to Vishnu. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So as long as it is done to satisfy the Vishnu Tattva, to the Supreme Lord, that becomes yajna. If we are doing any activity for the satisfaction of the Supreme Lord, And if there is some material motivation behind it, right? If we get
Mhm.
something material out of it, but ultimately we are trying to satisfy Krishna only, right? And if we want something out of return, that is not the topmost form of yajna, as Krishna says, anya abhilashita shunyam, right?
Right. It's not unalloyed. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
has to be unalloyed, right? That's the purest form of devotional service, and that is what all of us should aspire. But even if we praise the Supreme Lord for some material gains, it is not a bad thing actually. As Krishna says,
Mhm.
two type of people approach the Supreme Lord. Some may be desirous of wealth, and they want to get rid of the distress, right? Those two are also some of the people that Krishna described. If they have sufficient amount of sukriti, if they have done sufficient amount of good deeds in the previous lives, only then they will be motivated to come to Krishna to fulfill their material desires, right? So that's also very good. Actually, that's not at all bad, but it is not the purest form of devotional service. The
Mhm.
purest form of devotional service is that is totally unalloyed devotional, anya abhilashita shunya, without any other motivation. So that is what we are aspiring for. But
But but
irrespective of that, if I'm doing a but the yajna done for some other demigod, right? Not for the
mhm.
Supreme Lord. Although, as Krishna is saying in this particular verse, right? Bhoktaram yajna tapasam. Eventually, even if someone is doing a yajna to satisfy the demigods, and the benediction that a person gets by satisfying the demigod is eventually being provided by Krishna only, because even demigods are not the proprietors of anything in this material world, right? They own nothing. Everything is eventually coming from Krishna only, right? He himself is saying Bhoktaram Yagatapasam Sarva Loka Maheshwaram, right? So he is the complete proprietor of everything, and even those benedictions are indirectly coming from Krishna only. And ultimately, the beneficiary of the yajna itself, the fire sacrifice, although it may be done, for example, to satisfy Indra, eventually the benefits are going to Krishna only. But it's like an indirect way of serving the Supreme Lord. It's not really a direct way.
But it's, if you want something material, it's still better to approach Vishnu Tattva
Absolutely.
or Krishna. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Because there is some hope that eventually, as you keep worshipping,
Yeah.
that Krishna will give you the grace of
Oh, yeah.
transformation.
Yeah, no, that is confirmed actually. It's not even if someone is doing a motivated, if a person approaches Krishna through some motivation, and we can see, Dhruv Maharaj is an example. Right? Dhruv Maharaj did not approach Krishna he did not ask for the pure love of Godhead, right? When he started off, he wanted
Right.
the kingdom of his father, right? He wanted the highest kingdom possible. And that's why, when Narad Muni came and Narad Muni saw he was extremely determined, he basically gave the seed of bhakti to him, but it started off as a material desire, right? But eventually when he kept doing that, and when Krishna asked him, what do you want, right? He said, I do not want anything, right? That desire was totally uprooted from his heart. And we see other examples when, there are, for example, Hiranyakashipu, right? He did such a hard work towards Lord Brahma, right? But when Lord Brahma asked him the boons, he said, I want this is right. He had a long list of things that he wanted. In fact, the very top thing that he wanted was that I should become invincible. No one should be able to kill me. And Brahma said, that's something that I cannot give, because I myself do not have that, right? So if I do not have something, I cannot give it to you. But then he went about a very roundabout way to ask the same thing, right? But you would see so many examples where devotees approach Krishna initially with a material motivation, but by the time they complete their yajna, that material motivation is totally uprooted from within their heart, because Krishna's name himself, Krishna Bhakti is always so purifying. Eventually, they just want Krishna.
Mhm.
So that is the difference between approaching Krishna and between approaching any other demigods, right? So Krishna, whenever we approach Krishna, although we may be initially motivated, but ultimately the result will always be pure devotional service.
Yeah, sounds right. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question, Mataji. Anything else, anyone?
Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Prabhu, you said that it's not possible to approach Krishna before without a guru. So, what did you exactly mean there? Is it like a Shiksha Guru or a Diksha Guru, or both, or one of those? And the other thing I want to ask about this is I've heard from some devotees that you know there might be cases where a person had a guru in a previous life, a bona fide spiritual master, but due to whatever reason he was not able to complete his spiritual practices in that life, and in this life, even if he doesn't surrender to a guru, he can still go back. That is second. The third thing I want to ask is, even in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna does say that you can approach a spiritual master and try to learn from the truth, from him the truth, but he doesn't make it like a make or break condition that if you don't do it, then you won't come to me. In fact, at multiple places, he said, if you just surrender to me, you can come back to me. He says, Janma karma cha me divyam.
Yeah.
So what do you want to say about it, Prabhuji?
Yeah. So that's a good point, Prabhuji. So whenever, in general, when we talk about things, right, we want to, everything is possible, right? Nothing is impossible for Krishna. If he wants, he can reclaim pretty much anyone instantly, right? But, those are usually the outliers, right? So you cannot trust yourself to become the outlier, right? You would want to stay within the normal distribution, right? And the normal distribution is we need to approach a spiritual master, follow the instructions, and then ultimately we can achieve Krishna through the spiritual master. That's the norm. But of course, Krishna is completely free, right? If he wants, everything is possible. He can pretty much claim anyone, right? So there could be some anomalies, right? There could be some outliers, but the outliers cannot become the norm, right? So for us, we simply stick to this principle that we need complete submission to the instructions of our spiritual master. But to your point, absolutely, there could be some instances, but they are, in my understanding, it's very, very rare, and we should not really risk to be one of, we should not really think that, we could be one of those outliers. It's a very risky proposition.
I know, Ganpati Govind, that's a good point. The outliers would be like Gajendra, right? And did Jada Bharat have a guru? I don't remember.
Yeah,
but
Jada Bharat did not have a guru, right? So that would fall in the category of what Prabhuji just said, right? In one of his lives, he had a spiritual master and they made a certain amount of spiritual progress. They were already at a certain stage.
Right.
They were, like, Jada Bharat was already at the stage of a bhava, right? So he was at a very high stage. And, Krishna basically, to teach us an example, basically he created that outlier. So there could be some of those outliers, absolutely, right? But that's not the norm. So we should not risk that.
So when we talk about guru, do you mean Shiksha Guru or Diksha Guru, or both, or one of those, or either of those?
Yeah. In my understanding, Diksha Guru, who basically gives us the instructions, who initiates us, is what we need.
Okay.
And makes that connection, yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And that too in a bona fide, sampradaya, not just anyone, right? So basically, when it comes to making progress in the spiritual life, right, the example that is usually given is that of a creeper, right, a plant, right, a sapling. So you need a fertile soil first of all, and then you need a good quality seed. So that good quality seed is essentially the Harinam that we receive from a bona fide spiritual master, right, coming in a bona fide sampradaya. So based on the quality of the seed will determine how quickly the plant of bhakti will grow, right? And the fertility of the soil is essentially whatever we have done in our previous lives, right? So for example, in the case of Jal Marat, the Jal Bharat, the soil was already so fertile, right? He hardly needed anything. It was already, everything was already there. But in most of the cases, whatever we have done in our previous lives, that's like the fertility of the soil. And when we receive a good quality seed in the form of Harinam Diksha from our spiritual master coming in the bona fide sampradaya, and that gets planted into that ground, that fertile soil, that results in growing the plant of bhakti. And then we have to kind of secure it. We have to protect it from all of the anarthas, right, by various do's and don'ts in order for that plant to become strengthened and grow. So that's the usual process. That's the norm. But of course, there could be outliers.
Yeah, thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. Okay, so I think it's 8:05. We'll pay obeisances to all the Vaishnavas. Vancha kalpatarubhyascha Anantakoti Vaishnava ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Thank you also.
Abhiram Devya Prabhu ki jai.
Hare Krishna. All goes to Srila Prabhupada.
Hare Krishna, everyone.